Hi sewing friends, welcome to my sewing room. My name is Beth, and if you're new, welcome. You might remember this quilt right here. We did a Pink Stars quilt along recently, and I wanted my quilt to be just a little bit bigger. So I added a row of blocks, just some leftover blocks that had been sort of my practice blocks, and then I added a piano key border right here with some of the leftover fabric. I'm really happy. It grew to be a double-sized quilt now instead of more of a twin or throw size. So I'm going to walk you through how I added a simple border to my quilt. Let's get started. Before adding my piano key border, I added a 5-inch border with this fabric right here, and I'm showing you the salvage. Instead of cutting the width of the fabric, I'm going to fold the fabric long ways, folding it in half. I think I have about 1.5 yards, and I will be cutting right along one side, one of those salvages, so I will get a longer piece of fabric. And if I didn't have enough of this, I would have cut the width of fabric, and then I would have had a seam with my border. My quilt, after adding 5 blocks and some sashing, measures 64 by 64. So my border with this fabric needs to be pretty long. 2 need to be 64 and the others need to be at least 74. So I am not going to measure the length. I'm going to cut my long 5-inch wide strip longer than I need, and then I will just attach it to my quilt, and then I'll trim. After pinning it, I will attach it and then I'll trim. It's when you're using long strips, you don't want to attach without pinning because the lengths seem to change because of the feed dogs just pulling that bottom layer. You want to pin, especially when it's a long piece like this. So I'm going to trim off the salvage, give myself a straight edge, and then I will be cutting 4 5-inch wide strips to go all around my quilt. I'm going to take that first long 5-inch strip and I will be attaching it to the side of my quilt with pins, right sides together, all the way down, and then I will sew the first border on. After getting all of my 5-inch borders on, I chose some of the fabrics that I had used in my quilt. I ended up using 8 fabrics, and this was my first pull, and then I realized I needed a little bit of blue for this piano key border. So I chose 2 blues, and I only ended up using 1 of those pretty soft blues. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to cut my strips the width of the fabric, and I varied my strips. Some were 3 inches and some were 2.5 inches. I like the variety. They could all be the same, but I prefer using a variety, and one of the reasons is that when you get to the end of the quilt, the piano key border, I don't measure it to size or try to figure out how many of these 3 inches I need to fit exactly on the side of the quilt. So sometimes when I put that piano key down next to the quilt, it's a little bit long and I need to trim. And if the strips are slightly different, it's not quite as noticeable that you have trimmed off the edge, off the end of the piano key border. I hope that's easy to understand. I started by cutting 2 strips from each fabric, and I ended up needing about 4 strips, and I did have some left over. So I ended up cutting 4 strips from each of my 8 fabrics. Like I said, some were 3 inch and some are 2.5 inch wide. And this piano key border would be great to use with leftover fabrics, scraps. I've made a lot of these kind of borders, and they're a lot of fun because you can use up your pieces. This is a more controlled border than some of the other ones I have done in the past, and here's a 2.5 inch strip. So I'll do that a couple times, but in the end I needed 4 strips from each of my 8 fabrics to go all the way around my quilt. When I had all of my strips cut, I sat down and I put 3 strips together with a 1/4 inch seam, and I did that twice, and then I had 2 left over, so I did groups of 3, 2 groups of 3 and 1 group of 2, and then I cut these long strips into 5 inch segments. After getting all of my 5 inch segments ready to go, I joined them in groups of 8, and then I put them next to my quilt and figured out how many I would need for each side. I did just work on one side at a time. That's how I tend to do this. I don't figure everything out ahead of time. I just work one side at a time, and it usually works out pretty good in the end. And here I am putting the right sides together, and then I'll do a 1/4 inch seam, and I'll do that 4 times all around the quilt. Using up this extra fabric to make a quilt bigger is so satisfying. Here's my long border with all of those really pretty prints. I'm happy that I was able to use some more fabric to get this quilt bigger. Now instead of 64 by 64, it'll be closer to 84 by 84 just with those two 5-inch borders. And you can see here that my piano key is a little bit too long. I just trimmed it, I made it fit, and the quilt is ready to go. The quilt top is ready to go. Now I need to quilt it so that we can use it. Thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.